I was visiting my grandmother, and she lives in the isolated hills of northwest Alabama. And we were sitting around the fireplace telling stories, and my great uncle had come by to visit since I was in town. And I was telling them about a recent trip to Paris, and he suddenly started to shift a little bit, and he said, yeah, I was there in Paris with Patton. Suddenly the room grew very quiet. My great uncle had never spoken about the war, but what he wanted to tell me that night was how he helped liberate a women's concentration camp. That to him was, I think, one of the most horrific things that he saw, and it's what he felt was the most important thing to tell us about that night. It's been over 30 years since I made a promise to my great uncle to tell others what he had seen with his own two eyes. And as a filmmaker, I'm finally able to fulfill that promise. It was many, many years later when I met a woman named Martha Hall Kelly, who was working on her first novel, a work of historical fiction called Lilac Girls. She had uncovered this story about some women in a women's concentration camp known as Ravensbruck. It was about 90 miles from Berlin, and it held women from over 20 nations, Jewish women, Protestant women, Catholic women, even Bolsheviks from Russia, women who had been with the Russian army. The story remained hidden until Martha Hall Kelly found it, really stumbled on it at the Bellamy Faraday house when she was there to visit the gardens, Carolyn Faraday's famous gardens. And she saw on Carolyn Faraday's desk this picture of 30 or 40 women, and she just asked, who are they? And they answered, they said, those are the Rabbits, young girls in the Polish resistance who had been subjected to horrific surgeries on their legs while they were in the camp. They were nicknamed the Rabbits because they were the laboratory animals of the Nazis. They were testing the efficacy of sulfa drugs, and they would open up their legs, put in glass chips, wood chips, aggressive bacteria, and see if they could recreate gas gangrene. And then they were testing to see if sulfa drugs would heal the gas gangrene. Carolyn Faraday helped some of the survivors of that camp after the war, brought them over to America for treatment. They really brutalized and maimed these young girls from Poland. Most of them were part of the Girl Scouts. They were high school and college age kids, and like so many women in Europe, joined up with the resistance. Ravensbruck was formed in 1939, prior to the start of the war, and the first prisoners in the camp were women who were in some form of resistance against the Nazi regime. So it would have been German women and Austrian women at that point. Austria had been annexed into Germany, and so those would have been the very first prisoners at the camp. Then they started their social hygiene program. So anybody who didn't fit into the National Socialist ideal would have been put into the camp. So criminals, prostitutes, lesbians would have been sent to the camp. Women that for some reason had a hard time holding down a job. Anybody who did not fit into the idea of a perfect German was in this camp. Ravensbruck was an important camp because it was the one that held all women prisoners. It was designed exclusively to hold women. But as Germany started up the war and started moving into Poland and started invading other countries, they had to do something with all these women who were in the resistance, and so they were sent to Ravensbruck. There were Jewish women at the camp from the very beginning, but they were there not because they were Jewish, but because they were resisting against the Nazi regime. The camp itself was primarily political prisoners, and probably 10 to 20% are the estimates in terms of the population of the camp that was Jewish. But so all walks of life, all kinds of women would have been at that camp. And I was struck First, because it was a women's concentration camp, and I wondered who liberated it. Could this possibly be related to my uncle? And I would do research on my own, trying to find where my uncle might have been and was this related. And what I found was, indeed, many of the women that my uncle would have liberated at one of the sub-camps, it was an all-woman sub-camp, likely started their journey in Ravensbruck, which was a clearinghouse for labor. One day I just started thinking, are any of these women still alive? This was an amazing story. These women of the resistance, I wondered about that part of the story, wondered about the experimental surgeries, and the women themselves, these young girls, lived only because of the other women in the camp, all the other nationalities who got together before they were going to be executed by the Nazis and came up with this incredible, daring rescue plan. There were 63 of these crippled and maimed girls, and they saved all 63. So I wondered, at the end of the war, when you finally see light at the end of the tunnel, why would some of these women then risk their life to save these young Polish girls? It was difficult to find them. It seems like it would be easier than it was. And I think one reason, they're in Poland. People are protective, so people don't just readily send you information. Martha knew the daughter of one of the rabbits who since passed away, and this daughter lived in America. And I had written to her, and she answered me back and said some of the survivors would be at the commemoration of the liberation of the camp. It was the 70th anniversary of the liberation of the camp, and 2 of them would be there in 2 weeks. So we had 2 weeks to scramble, pull together a crew, figure out the funding, and get there. Eventually we were able to meet them, find them, and arrange an interview. And that started our process. So once I was able to make contact with them and other people in the Polish community, then I was able to find the other 2, and we found there were 4 survivors when we started the project, and I was able to talk to all 4 of them. And then eventually I found a woman in the French resistance who had helped them both in the camp and was the connection between these women and Carolyn Faraday and these postal bonnets. She was still alive in Paris, and eventually I was able to interview her as well. And so what I wanted to do is tell the story from their perspective, let them tell us exactly what happened. We found an interpreter, and I lucked out that I found this wonderful girl who lives in Berlin, but she's Polish. So she was fluent in German, fluent in Polish, fluent in English, of course, and she is a lovely human being. I learned very quickly that the interview will be dependent on, the success of that interview will be dependent upon that communication, level of communication between that interpreter and who's being interviewed. I can be as diplomatic as I want in framing a question, but if the interpreter delivers it in a different way, the interview can go south very quickly. You know, they can quickly offend the person and you have no idea what's going on. So I was lucky in finding the right one, and then I decided on simultaneous translation, so I could be in there. I had on my headphones, and the interpreter was in another room, and literally she was interpreting for me as they were speaking. And then I would ask a question, and then she would be able to ask it. And so we tried to keep it as conversational as possible, and I know it was probably difficult for them because my reactions were never in real time, and I was the face they were seeing, not the interpreters. But they eventually got used to it, and eventually I couldn't even tell the difference. It was that quick. That still doesn't mean that the interpreter catches everything, and you get back and you start looking at the transcriptions and translations and realize, oh my gosh, they said this, and this is what I really wanted to know, and I didn't know to ask that. I'm just finding this out. One of the things that I should have been prepared for but didn't occur to me was the level of trauma. A lot of these women may have told their stories to their loved ones. Some had given interviews, not everybody, but they were used to one story that they told. And usually that story was told in this sort of general way, not a personal way, and I think that kept it a little bit more distant. I let them tell me that story, and then I would go through and start to dissect it. Okay, tell me now this part, where were you standing? What were you thinking? What were you feeling? And that was where suddenly I would catch them off guard. And sometimes they would deflect by telling me what they had for breakfast the day before, or, I mean, just some really unrelated random story. But I found if I let them just continue to talk, they would find a way to get there for me. It wasn't anything that we couldn't work around, because I think these women really did want to tell what happened. Clearly, once I asked them those kind of questions, it would bring them back to that place, and you could tell and see it. And in those cases, you know, once in a while we would have to stop or take a break or have a moment. Maybe they might start to cry, or in some cases, depending on the story, I would have to be struggling to compose myself as well. So it could be very emotional at times for everybody. After those initial interviews at the camp, I knew I needed to talk to them again. I knew that just having this amount of time, even though they told me amazing things and I thought they were wonderful interviews, that I needed to go further. And especially when I got back and started reading it and seeing, wow, I need to spend time here. You start to be able to identify. So I was able to go back and talk to all of them but one. And I think through that, you kind of develop a relationship, setting it up, and you get to know their family members that you're working with to be able to set up those interviews. And those I conducted in their home, and that's a whole nother level. And I found that was a sort of another lesson learned. You know, it's best at home where they're comfortable. Everything is safe there, and they can go a little further in what they tell you. I admired all of them to begin with, and then I just loved them for their personalities as well. Great senses of humor. You can see what helped them get through the camp, and they brought it up themselves, that their sense of humor really went a long way to helping them survive. And one of them even said, Stasha, who might be one of the funniest people I've ever met in my life, she said, "You'll think that we're crazy, but that's what we use. And what's to laugh about in a concentration camp? We found it. Whatever it was, we found a way to laugh about it, and it kept us human." I had pieces of the story. Certainly, you know, I had testimony from the Nuremberg trials. I had a book that Wanda Potofska, one of the women I interviewed, that she wrote after the war that detailed their experiences. So I had kind of a basic blueprint, but I also really did try to let them tell me what was emotionally important for them. What came out was much more than just that one story about the rescue. We hear about compassion and this strength and this solidarity that started from the very beginning in the camp, how women helped one another. And I think it does give us a very truthful view into how women survive, how these women resisted the Nazi regime still in the camp. I told somebody, I think eventually, I started to understand they were teaching me what questions to ask. Every single woman that I spoke to talked about the Russians and all the rapes after the war. So the Russians got to the camp first, but what I found out, those were the women that were left at the camp. They had started a march out of the camp before that point, and many of the rabbits were on those death marches. And those were liberated by American soldiers. And what was so interesting, it wasn't because it was the American front, it was a small group of soldiers that had been sent on a secret mission to go meet up with the Russians behind enemy lines. And as these Americans were working their way through, they ran into these death marches. And Wanda Roshevitz, one of the rabbits that I spoke with, talks about the Americans coming and suddenly Germans throwing away their guns, or some of them kissed them and put them gently to the ground. Others slung them like they never wanted to see them again. And suddenly all the Germans were nice to them. And it was those American soldiers who did liberate them. Another woman told a story. She wasn't a rabbit. She was one of the Polish women who knew them in the camp. She talks about one of those soldiers being kind to her. She said all of a sudden the Germans disappeared, and she saw the tanks, she saw the Americans, and she said, "I saw freedom." And one of the Americans came over and offered his hand and helped her and got her to a house and had somebody take care of her there. So one of the sort of recurring stories I heard and that I was so proud to hear was the kindness of our troops with these women. So when I was looking up and researching about that particular group of American soldiers who liberated that death march, there was one still living. We were able to find one of those men who liberated those death marches, and we were able to talk to him, and it was so interesting because he's telling us about we're arriving in this town, it's getting dark, and Wanda Roshevitz talking about we're struggling walking in this town, this horrific death march, you know, it's getting dark. And he's talking about what the Germans are doing, and she's talking about from her perspective. He was fascinating. He was an Orthodox Jew from New York. He said he went over really wanting to kill every German that he saw. And when in one of these towns, he ran into one of the Ravensbruck survivors. And so he went up to her to talk to her, and they were speaking Yiddish. And she told him about being in the camp and German guards helping her, and Germans in the town. And I think one of the things that keeps coming out in this story as these women are talking was the very thing that Arthur Blyvis, the veteran, said was, he goes, "I was just blown away that Germans helped, but I thought all Germans were evil." And he said, and I said to her something that wasn't wise, but it was what I was thinking at the time, I guess there are bad Germans and there are good Germans. And he said, and now I realize that's true. There are good Americans, there are bad Americans. And he said, that's more of the truth of it. It's just not so simple. I think the other thing I discovered when I was researching the camp is that a lot of the women would try to sketch. They would try to capture the horror of the camp and what they were seeing. I think a lot of them realized it was important to document what was happening. And we have very few photographs, no archival footage that I know of. I've looked for it everywhere. And really the truest representation of what was going on in the camp are those sketches. And they aren't necessarily, a lot of them are just charcoal. You know, it's whatever they could find at the time on whatever they could gather up at the time. Remember, all of this is punishable by death. So it was a very courageous act to create this art in the camp, to try to document what was going on in these atrocities. And so the more I started to discover so much of it, so much wonderful documentation, even of the rabbits. I think for the women in the camp, this sight of 60+ young girls on crutches and these horrific injuries to their legs, it stuck with all of them. So I actually have sketches of the rabbits themselves in the camp. And I think once I realized that, I knew that's what I wanted to work in terms of the visual. So we even tried to work it in with rotoscoping. So I have the archival footage of, let's say, the invasion of Poland. I want to get across the idea, we're going to hear this really happened, real events, but we're also going to get somebody's point of view about it. They're a witness to it, but it's their point of view, and thus that rotoscoping and the animation that we'll use in the film. So while we were filming in Lublin, Poland, we met up with a woman who's in charge of a museum there that covers the resistance in Poland. But where they've put the museum is where the Gestapo used to torture the people from the resistance. So the women themselves would have been taken there when they were captured and tortured horribly under the clock. And when we were there, they had just received a whole group of what we call the urine letters. The rabbits sent messages to their family in disappearing ink. And normally you could use something like onion juice, but food was not readily available in the camp. And they realized they could use their own urine. So they hid up in the lofts of the barracks and wrote in this beautiful penmanship in their own urine and detailed all the atrocities going on in the camp. They not only wrote about the operations, but who was responsible, what they thought was happening, the dates of the surgeries, any information that they felt might be helpful, not only for the families back home to know what was happening, what had happened to their daughters, but to be able to be used in war crimes trials after the war, which they were all determined that the Allies were going to win and that justice was going to prevail, and they wanted to make sure it prevailed for those women in the camp. There are many reasons the other women in the camp came together to save the rabbits, but I think a large part of it was they were a living proof of the horrors of the camp. And by saving the rabbits, they also saved witnesses that were witnesses, became witnesses at the Nuremberg trials. They were able to bring the Nazi doctors to justice after the war. So the commandant was executed. The head doctor, Gebhardt, who had designed the experiment, he was executed after the war. The rabbits were able to feel, at least, like they were able to bring the perpetrators to justice. Our biggest production challenge, other than finding the women, convincing them to let me interview them, and doing this in Poland and France with the language barriers, the next thing was, it's really funding. Between Atlanta, the fundraisers I held in Atlanta and fundraisers I held in Chicago, I was able to fund really the first big trip over to be able to go to the homes of these women and get these in-depth interviews I needed, a lot of B-roll footage, and I got a lot accomplished in those 2 weeks. But it really was just fundraising, people giving to the project because they believed in it. As I went along, the story was always being written and rewritten. And by the time I got to the point of, okay, let's start pulling this together, I knew where I wanted to go. And I already knew from the interviews, those moments of truth that I was getting, something that I felt was really important for people to understand about the story. So luckily, there was a lot of that material, and it really was more paring it down. What tells this point the most effectively, and whose voice do we need to hear from at this moment? It's a daunting task, but I think once the story was crystallized in my mind, it really was just going through and pulling it from those sections. It's already, there's complex material in terms of understanding the camp and how it works, because you can't fully grasp what the women are telling you unless you start to really understand how a concentration camp works. On one level is this simple story about these girls seeking freedom and what they needed to do to get there, but the world that they're in is so foreign to us. And you think you understand it, but I found again and again and again that all of a sudden I had new meaning from what they said because I started to really understand how the system works. So I want to make sure that the audience gets that world, and so I don't want them having to guess about where we are time-wise. But I will say that at the beginning, I have the narrator of the film will be Wanda Potofska, and she's speaking to us as an old lady. And so she is the one that's going to be narrating through this story, not just the knowledge of being there, but also a little bit of the perspective of where this is going. I do start really in the present, and I will bring it back to the present, but we will hear her journey in between. This film could only be done as an independent film, what seems counterintuitive because the resources that it takes to take on this project are so immense. But I think that might scare away a bigger entity. Oh, we'll never find the women. Oh, you know, we'll have this problem and that problem. How will we ever tell this story? Because they wouldn't have gone in and done the research. I think that is the strength of independent films, because it relies on, not on logic, but on passion. Having full creative freedom is very important for me, and especially with this kind of project, because one of the main themes of the story is the fact that it was all these diverse women, all these different cultures, countries, languages, religions, political beliefs that came together to rescue the rabbits. And like I said, that's one example of a multitude of what happened every day in that camp. I've been trying to protect this from any political point of view, any religious point of view, and trying even culturally to make sure that the women are able to tell their story and that I'm not enforcing my own ideology or one that might be convenient for the time. And I've been able to steer clear of that because I'm independent. I came to realize that compassion is the strongest thing we have. And it was only compassion that saved the Rabbits of Ravensbruck. There was no other way to defy the Nazis. And in fact, their blindness, this ideology of this might makes right ideology, and their determination and firm belief that self-interest rules, that's why these women were able to beat them in the camp, why they were able to always come up against them and find a way around them, because they were blind to the fact that these women would have helped each other, that they would have risked their lives for one another. So Stasha, one of the rabbits, tells a story about one of the Russian women came up to her and she said, "Thank me now because I won't live to see the end of the day." So when they did this, they fully thought they were sacrificing their lives for these Polish girls. But they lived because the Nazis couldn't imagine that level of compassion. I also thought that when I would talk to somebody like an Anise Postel-Venet, this woman in the French resistance that helped save them in the camp, risked her own life, and I asked her that question, why would you have risked your life in the camp when you were very close to being liberated? The war was almost over. And she said, "What are you talking about? I didn't have a choice." Like, what kind of question is that? And it came across again and again in every survivor account. When they had done something like that, they said, "I didn't have a choice." And that's because that also is instinctive in us. It is part of us. And Wanda Potowska talks about, these are the choices we make every day. She said it shouldn't have come down to a rescue of the girls in the camp, right? If people had made the right decisions early on, there would have never been a concentration camp. And that's what we have to learn. Yes, the light of humanity shines brighter in that darkness, but we have those choices every day to make. And I'm hoping that's what people will take away. And it's all of us. It doesn't matter our country, it doesn't matter our religion, it doesn't matter our political point of view. We all believe that same thing. We all have that goodness in us. And I will hope and continue to hope that we will choose to act on it.